Imagine this. You're standing on the bridge of a German U-boat, the most feared weapon in the world. The sea is silent, until suddenly, it isn't. Your sonar pings echo back something impossible. You're being watched. Moments later, the sky erupts. Explosions rip through the waves. The boat lurches. Men scream. And just like that, the hunters of the Atlantic become the hunted. How did it happen? How did an invisible arm of American ingenuity turn the tides of the Atlantic and crush Hitler's pride beneath the waves? This is the secret war fought not in headlines, but in radio signals, radar beams, and desperate whispers through the cold Atlantic night. A war where science met courage, where machines learned to stalk ghosts, and where the fate of the free world balanced on the sonar hum of unseen submarines. This is the story of the hunters who hunted the hunters. If you're ready to dive into one of history's most mind-blowing naval battles, a story of courage, code-breaking, and pure human determination, hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you don't miss the next chapter of hidden history. And hey, share this with a friend who loves World War II stories, because trust me, this one will change how you see the ocean forever. The North Atlantic was not just a battlefield. It was a graveyard. Beneath its endless gray horizon, steel monsters prowled in silence. They were sleek, efficient, and terrifyingly effective. Hitler's U-boats, the Grey Wolves of Admiral Karl Dönitz. Each one carried a crew barely older than university students, sealed inside a steel coffin with a single mission: starve Britain into submission. Every night, merchant convoys crept through the dark, hoping to slip unseen between the waves. And every night, torpedoes streaked through the black water like phantom blades. Ships burned. Oil slicks spread across the sea. Men clung to wreckage in freezing water while, miles away, unseen periscopes watched them drift into silence. It was warfare without warning, without mercy, and for a time the U-boats seemed unstoppable. By early 1943, the Atlantic was bleeding. Over 500,000 tons of Allied shipping went down in a single month, a scale of destruction so vast that even Winston Churchill later admitted, "The U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened me." And it wasn't bravado. Britain's survival depended on those convoys. Food, fuel, ammunition, the lifeblood of an island nation under siege. Each ship lost wasn't just steel. It was hunger, darkness, and fear creeping closer to London's shores. The wolf packs moved like coordinated assassins. 20, sometimes 30 submarines converging on a convoy, striking from every direction, vanishing into the depths before dawn. For sailors aboard merchant ships, the ocean itself became the enemy, vast, cold, and treacherously alive. But for the men inside those U-boats, victory came at a terrible price. Life below the surface was suffocating, literally. The air grew stale within hours. Diesel fumes mixed with sweat and oil. The pressure of the deep pressed against their skulls until it felt like the sea itself wanted to crush them. Yet, they endured. They believed they were invincible, the silent elite, unseen predators shaping the fate of nations. They mocked Allied sailors as sitting ducks. They toasted each sinking with laughter and music blaring from gramophones. But beneath that bravado, a quiet arrogance had taken root. They had no idea that the very ocean that hid them would soon betray them. Because somewhere across the Atlantic, in offices filled with chalkboards and cigarette smoke, American engineers and naval strategists were asking a dangerous question. What if we stopped defending convoys and started hunting the hunters? That single thought, simple, almost heretical, would rewrite the laws of naval warfare. The era of the hunted U-boat was about to begin. But in the early months of 1943, no one could have imagined how quickly the wolves would become the prey. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic had become a chessboard soaked in oil and blood. Every convoy that left North America carried not just supplies, but hope, and everyone that vanished beneath the waves pushed Britain closer to the edge. The German U-boats ruled the ocean like ghosts, striking from the darkness and disappearing before help could arrive. To the sailors who fought them, it felt hopeless. No radar strong enough, no escort fast enough, no sky patrol wide enough. It seemed as though the sea itself had chosen a side, and it wasn't theirs. In London, war rooms buzzed with desperation. Every ton of lost cargo was tallied like a heartbeat skipped. Churchill, pacing beneath the flickering lights of his bunker, was haunted by a single truth. Britain could win every battle on land and still lose the war at sea. But across the ocean in Washington and Norfolk, a new kind of thinking was taking shape, cold, mathematical, and revolutionary. American strategists studied the grim arithmetic of tonnage war and realized something simple but devastating. Defending was not enough. Convoy escorts, brave as they were, could only react. They were chained to the very ships they protected, forced to wait for an attack before striking back. The U-boats held the initiative, always dictating the terms of battle. So what if the rules changed? What if, instead of guarding the convoys like shepherds, the Allies became wolves themselves? A radical idea began to form, one that would turn the ocean into a hunting ground of its own. The transformation started quietly, not with fanfare, but with shipyard workers welding steel on foggy mornings. America's factories were roaring. Assembly lines that once built cars now churned out warships. But this new fleet wasn't made of giant carriers or dreadnoughts. It was something humbler, faster to build, and far more dangerous: escort carriers. Merchant hulls converted into compact floating airfields, each carrying just a few dozen planes, but capable of scouring hundreds of miles of ocean. Paired with swift destroyer escorts, these small groups could operate independently, free from convoy routes. They could roam the Atlantic with one purpose: to find and destroy U-boats before they ever reached their prey. Thus, the concept of the hunter-killer group was born, a blend of daring strategy, cutting-edge technology, and cold efficiency. Yet it wasn't just steel and machinery that turned the tide. It was a change in mindset. The Allies began to fight like predators, proactive, relentless, and systematic. Intelligence officers pored over intercepted Enigma signals. Mathematicians charted U-boat patterns like hunters, tracking migration routes. Radar operators learned to read the sea's faint whispers, a flicker on a screen, a shadow that didn't belong. Slowly, piece by piece, the ocean that had once sheltered the gray wolves began to betray them. And in that betrayal, history shifted. The hunters of the deep had no idea that their reign of terror was already ending. They just couldn't see it yet, but the Americans could. The idea sounded almost reckless at first, to take small, hastily converted merchant ships and send them into the vast Atlantic, not to protect, but to hunt. Yet in the early months of 1943, the world had reached a point where desperation demanded boldness. The U.S. Navy's answer came in the form of the escort carrier, modest in size, slow compared to the great fleet carriers of the Pacific, but fast enough to change the fate of the Atlantic. These floating airfields were the heart of a new strategy. Around each carrier sailed a ring of destroyer escorts, sleek, maneuverable ships armed with sonar, depth charges, and a new weapon called the Hedgehog, a spiked mortar that could blanket a submarine's hiding place with deadly precision. Together they formed a team unlike anything the sea had ever seen: hunter-killer groups, mobile packs designed not to defend convoys, but to scour the ocean for the enemy itself. The USS Bogue was the first of these strange hybrids to set sail. She wasn't glamorous. Her decks were cramped, her speed unimpressive, and her air group barely a fraction of what the big carriers carried. But she had something far more valuable: freedom. Free from the slow pace of merchant convoys, the Bogue could roam the Atlantic on her own terms. Her aircraft, Wildcats and Avengers, became the eyes of the fleet, sweeping radar beams across hundreds of miles of ocean. Above the clouds, pilots scanned endless water. Below the waves, sonar men strained to catch the faint echo of a hull. It was a partnership between air and sea, between instinct and instrumentation. Every ping, every radar blip, every oil slick mattered. For the first time, the Allies weren't waiting for the wolves to strike. They were hunting them in their own waters. Behind this transformation was something invisible but powerful: intelligence. At Bletchley Park, British cryptanalysts were cracking Enigma codes faster than ever before. Across the Atlantic, the newly formed U.S. 10th Fleet, a fleet that existed only on paper, coordinated the movements of these hunter groups with chilling precision. They knew where U-boats refueled, where wolf packs gathered, even which captains were at sea. It was as if the Allies had begun to see through the ocean itself. A U-boat could run silent, but it could no longer hide. Every radio message it sent betrayed a clue. Every burst of static whispered its position. The hunters had learned the rhythm of their prey, and they were closing in. For the young sailors aboard the Bogue, it was a strange new kind of war. There were no grand battleships exchanging shells, no flags flying in triumph, only patience, tension, and the endless hum of machinery. Hours stretched into days, days into weeks of searching an ocean that seemed empty. And then, in the blink of an eye, the emptiness would explode into chaos. Alarms blaring, engines roaring, aircraft diving toward a faint blip on the radar. This was not the war of glory and banners. It was a war of mathematics, machinery, and nerve, fought by men who knew that at any moment they might be the ones caught in the crosshairs. Yet beneath the fear burned something stronger: resolve. They had been sent not to survive, but to hunt, and soon the Atlantic would feel their presence. For centuries, the ocean had been the ultimate disguise, a shroud of darkness where ships could vanish without a trace. But in 1943, that illusion began to die. For the first time in history, humanity was learning to see through the sea itself. The secret lay not in brute force, but in invisible waves, radio signals, radar pulses, and sound frequencies that pierced the Atlantic's ancient silence. On the decks of American escort carriers, glowing radar screens painted ghostly shapes across the green haze. A periscope here, a surfaced hull there. What had once been invisible now flickered into focus. Somewhere below, German captains stared at the same darkness, unaware that the darkness was no longer theirs to command. It began with centimetric radar, an innovation so advanced that it felt like science fiction. Operating on wavelengths too short for German detectors to notice, it allowed Allied aircraft to spot a surfaced submarine in total darkness, even through fog or rain. A U-boat captain might surface at 2 a.m., believing himself hidden beneath a moonless sky, unaware that a blip had already appeared on a distant screen. Within minutes, an American Avenger would be overhead, engines howling, depth charges ready. The sea that once protected the hunter now betrayed him with every breath of his diesel engines. It was like the ocean had eyes, one captured German officer would later say. He wasn't far from the truth, but radar was only one weapon in this growing arsenal. There was Huff-Duff, or high-frequency direction finding, an unassuming antenna that could trace a submarine's radio transmission within minutes. Every time a U-boat sent a weather report or a message to headquarters, that signal bounced through the ether, and Allied operators were listening. With 3 readings from different ships, they could triangulate the source almost exactly. It was as if every whisper the Germans made echoed back across the ocean, revealing their position. And then came the most chilling innovation of all, the Mark 24 mine. Its name was a lie. It wasn't a mine at all, but the world's first acoustic homing torpedo. Dropped from an aircraft, it would sink quietly into the water, listen for the rhythmic thrum of submarine propellers, and chase that sound until it struck home. To U-boat crews, it seemed supernatural, a weapon that could hear them hiding. Each of these technologies alone was powerful, but together they changed everything. The Atlantic had become transparent. The hunters who once stalked in silence now moved under constant watch. Yet behind every radar pulse and sonar ping were human hands. Young radar operators staring into screens, radio technicians twisting dials through static, pilots peering into darkness for a flicker of foam. They weren't just fighting machines, they were learning to trust them, to believe that the faintest signal could mean the difference between life and death. The sea was no longer ruled by instinct or luck, it was ruled by data, precision, and relentless persistence. And as the spring of 1943 deepened into summer, that new vision began to bear its first deadly results. The USS Bogue slipped out of Norfolk Harbor beneath a slate-gray dawn, her decks slick with mist and diesel. She didn't look like the hero of any great naval legend, just a squat converted merchant ship with a flight deck barely long enough for her Avengers to launch from. But beneath her unremarkable silhouette was something new, something quietly revolutionary: intent. The Bogue wasn't sailing to escort anyone. She wasn't defending a convoy or guarding a route. She was sailing to hunt. Around her, 4 lean destroyer escorts fanned out, sonar arrays humming, depth charge racks loaded, radar antennas spinning in slow circles. To the men aboard, it felt like stepping into an experiment, part science, part gamble, and part vengeance. Somewhere out there in the black water, the gray wolves were waiting. The Bogue's mission was simple: find them first. For days, the Atlantic offered nothing but emptiness. Crews grew restless. Pilots stared at endless horizons until their eyes ached. Sonar men listened to static so long it began to sound like whispers. The tension was suffocating, a silent kind of fear that lived between the pings of sonar and the faint hum of engines. Then, on May 22, 1943, the quiet broke. Lieutenant William Chamberlain, flying a TBF Avenger, caught a faint pulse on his radar, a surfaced contact, 18 miles east. He banked hard toward the signal. Below, in the gloom, U-569 cruised on the surface, recharging its batteries, her crew exhausted after 7 weeks at sea. They never saw the Avenger until the dive began. Depth charges dropped in tight sequence, erupting around the hull. The sea exploded. The submarine buckled. Lights flickered out. When she surfaced again, crippled and broken, white flags waved from her periscope shears. For the first time, a German U-boat surrendered to an American hunter-killer group. The hunters had drawn first blood. Word spread like fire through the fleet. One U-boat captain, captured and trembling, muttered in disbelief, "They knew where we were, as if they could see through the ocean." That fear, that invisible awareness, became the Allies' greatest weapon. Over the following weeks, aircraft from the Bogue struck again and again. U-boats caught mid-refueling, engines exposed, decks cluttered with fuel hoses, easy prey. Each attack sent shockwaves through the German fleet. The myth of U-boat invincibility, the swagger that had defined the Kriegsmarine's undersea arm, began to fracture. Men whispered of wonder weapons, of American magic that found them no matter where they hid. To the German command, it seemed impossible. To the men on the Bogue, it was the sound of momentum shifting. By the end of that summer, the ocean's mood had changed. What once felt like German hunting grounds now belonged to the Americans. Every night, the Bogue's radar swept the horizon like a lighthouse of vengeance. Every morning, the crews checked the horizon for oil slicks and debris, the silent signatures of another victory. The hunter-killer doctrine had proven itself in fire and salt water. From that moment on, the Allies would no longer fight to survive the Atlantic. They would own it. The wolves had drawn blood for years, but now the pack was being hunted, one by one, until the sea that had once protected them became their grave. By late 1943, the hunters had become merciless. The Atlantic, once the domain of stealth and shadows, now roared with engines, gunfire, and the thunder of depth charges. The German captains, who once prowled with arrogance, found themselves running blind, chased from above by aircraft, stalked below by sonar, and hemmed in by destroyers closing fast. Every mile of ocean felt hostile. The U-boats, once feared as ghosts, were now cornered animals, lashing out in desperation. The sea was no longer silent. It was alive with the echoes of war. A survivor from one doomed crew later wrote, "The ocean betrayed us. It no longer hid our presence. It hunted us." The brutality reached a fever pitch on a night that sailors would speak of for decades, October 31st, 1943. The USS Bory, a small destroyer escort, picked up a radar contact, U-405, under the command of veteran Captain Ralph Hopman. The two vessels met amid storm-tossed waves under a pitch-black sky. What followed wasn't a naval engagement. It was a brawl. The Bory rammed the submarine head-on, the two ships grinding together like beasts locked in combat. At such close range, chaos reigned. American sailors fired pistols and flares across the gap. Germans hurled grenades and rifle fire back. The storm howled as men fought at arm's length, caught between fire and freezing spray. When they finally tore apart, the Bory unleashed her full fury, 4,000 rounds that ripped U-405 to pieces. Hopman went down with his ship. Hours later, the Bory herself was fatally damaged and scuttled. Victory, but at a terrible cost. Encounters like these became grimly common. The USS Buckley in 1944 clashed with U-66 in another surreal battle. The German submarine, too damaged to dive, tried to ram the destroyer. The two vessels collided at full speed, locking together in a chaos of gunfire and shouts. Sailors fought with whatever they could find, rifles, knives, even coffee mugs hurled across the decks. One American seaman later recalled, "It was like two monsters tearing each other apart." When the smoke cleared, U-66 was gone, her hull split open beneath the waves. It was no longer the cold, surgical warfare of torpedoes and sonar. It was carnage, personal and raw. And beneath that brutality lay something far deeper, the end of the U-boat's myth. By the winter of 1943, German morale had collapsed. The sea, once their greatest ally, had turned into a slaughterhouse. Entire wolf packs vanished without a trace. In October alone, 23 submarines were lost. Experienced crews, seasoned captains, gone forever. Each sinking wasn't just metal lost, it was knowledge, skill, confidence, erased. The once proud U-boat arm was now a shadow of itself, its remaining sailors running missions that felt less like patrols and more like death sentences. The hunters of the deep had become prey in a war machine that never slept, never hesitated, and never forgave. And as the wrecks piled up across the seabed, the Atlantic, vast, cold, and unfeeling, kept its silence. Only the echoes of battle remained. The morning of June 4, 1944, dawned deceptively calm off the coast of West Africa. The Atlantic stretched out like a sheet of dull metal, reflecting nothing, hiding everything. Beneath that stillness lurked U-505, a German submarine commanded by Captain Harold Lang. His crew was exhausted, his engines failing, and his luck running out. For days, the boat had been stalked by faint sonar echoes, distant aircraft hums, ghosts on the edge of perception. What Lange didn't know was that the USS Guadalcanal and her hunter-killer group were closing in fast. On the radar screens of the escort carrier's control room, a faint blip pulsed with eerie consistency. The hunters had found their mark. The attack began without warning. Depth charges rained down, bursting with such force that they lifted the submarine from the seabed. The lights flickered, pipes split, alarms screamed. Inside U-505, chaos ruled. Men stumbled through smoke-filled corridors as water surged through ruptured seams. Lange gave the only order left: abandon ship. In the frenzy, the crew opened the valves meant to scuttle the boat, to send it sinking before the enemy could seize it. But the ocean had other plans. As German sailors leapt into the waves, clutching life vests and shouting through the din, American destroyers roared in from the distance. And then, something extraordinary happened. Something that had never been done before. Instead of letting the U-boat sink, the Americans decided to board it. A boarding team from the destroyer USS Pillsbury, led by Lieutenant Albert David, leapt onto the still-floating submarine. The deck was slick with oil and seawater, the conning tower riddled with bullet holes. Below, water poured in fast. David and his men descended into the choking darkness, weapons drawn, lungs burning. They sealed off compartments, closed valves, and fought back the rising flood with raw muscle and willpower. Within minutes, against every expectation, they had stopped the sinking. For the first time in the entire war, an intact German U-boat had been captured at sea. The American flag rose above her hull. What had begun as a desperate assault ended as one of the greatest intelligence coups in naval history. When U-505 was finally towed into harbor, the full magnitude of the capture came to light. Inside her compartments lay code books, Enigma machines, and advanced acoustic torpedoes, a treasure trove of secrets. But beyond the technical victory was something deeper. For the Allies, it was proof that even the masters of the deep could be caught. For the Germans, it was humiliation, the final undeniable sign that the age of the Gray Wolves was over. As Admiral Dönitz received word of the loss, he said nothing. His silence spoke louder than any speech. The symbol of his once-feared fleet was now a prize, paraded before the world. The hunters had not just won, they had turned the sea itself against its former kings. By the end of 1943, the legend of the U-boat, the once-feared Gray Wolf, was dying beneath the waves. The Atlantic, which had once seemed endless and forgiving, now felt like a trap. Every mile of open water hid unseen eyes. Radar pulses swept through the night sky. Aircraft roamed where submarines once surfaced freely. Even the deep itself no longer offered sanctuary. Sonar pierced it, relentless and unblinking. For the German crews who dared to sail, it wasn't courage that kept them going anymore. It was duty, resignation, and a quiet kind of fatalism. The men who had once toasted victories in cramped mess halls now spoke in whispers about the slaughter. They no longer asked if they would return, only when they would be found. The numbers tell part of the story, but only part. In 1942, U-boats had sunk over 1,000 Allied ships. By 1944, that number had fallen by nearly 90%. The reason wasn't that the Germans had lost their nerve. It was that the Allies had mastered the system. Hunter-killer groups now operated with terrifying efficiency, coordinated through intelligence networks, radar grids, and code-breaking operations that seemed almost omniscient. Every time a U-boat surfaced, it risked being spotted. Every time it sent a message, it risked being traced. For the men inside those steel hulls, life became a grim countdown. Hours submerged until oxygen ran out, minutes on the surface before death arrived from above. One U-boat commander, after surviving a single patrol, wrote in his log, "We are not hunters anymore. We are the hunted." The collapse came swiftly and without ceremony. The U-boat bases along the French coast, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, once hives of precision and pride, were now under constant Allied bombardment. Supply chains disintegrated. Fuel grew scarce. Training programs were rushed to desperation. Teenage recruits were sent to sea with barely enough time to learn how to dive and surface. By 1944, the average age of a U-boat commander had dropped to just 26. Many were barely old enough to shave. They sailed knowing they would not return. Their missions reduced to gestures of defiance against inevitability. Even Admiral Donitz's own son, Peter, was killed when U-954 was sunk with all hands. The father of the U-boat fleet could not escape the fate he had built. By the time the tide of war turned irreversibly, the U-boat arm was shattered, not just in strength but in spirit. Out of 40,000 submariners who went to sea, 30,000 never came back. 75% of them vanished beneath the waves, entombed forever in the cold Atlantic darkness. Their loss rate was the highest of any branch in the German military. The wolf packs that once prowled with confidence had been hunted into extinction. The ocean floor became their graveyard, littered with the rusting remains of dreams and hubris. For years, the world had feared them, but in the end, the U-boats were undone not by bravery or luck, but by something far colder and more absolute, the systematic power of a nation that had learned to make the sea itself its weapon. In the end, it wasn't one battle, one ship, or even one invention that broke the U-boat's back. It was the system, a vast interlocking network of machines, minds, and men that learned to think faster, strike farther, and see deeper than ever before. The Allies had done something no navy in history had achieved. They had turned the chaos of the sea into an equation, one they could solve. Every radar pulse, every sonar ping, every coded signal fit into a growing web of intelligence. The ocean, once unknowable, was now mapped in patterns and probabilities. The hunter-killer groups were no longer just fleets. They were components of a machine, a living, breathing organism made up of aircraft, destroyers, mathematicians, and code-breakers. And that machine, once set in motion, never stopped. At its core was intelligence. The silent war fought in rooms filled with chalk dust and cigarette smoke, from Bletchley Park in England to Washington's 10th Fleet headquarters. There, analysts charted submarine positions not through guesswork, but through intercepted messages and deciphered coordinates. The Allies didn't need to see a U-boat to know where it was going. They could predict it. Every German radio transmission, every Enigma message, every refueling rendezvous was recorded, analyzed, and used to tighten the noose. To the Germans, it felt like sorcery. To the Americans and British, it was science perfected by desperation. As one intelligence officer put it later, we stopped reacting to the enemy. We began anticipating him. Then came the arsenal of democracy, the sheer industrial momentum that Germany could never match. In American shipyards, Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines faster than the U-boats could sink them. Every month, 100 new vessels joined the convoys, carrying food, fuel, and soldiers across the Atlantic. Each time a U-boat sent one to the bottom, 3 more took its place. Escort carriers were built in months, destroyer escorts in weeks. It was warfare at an industrial scale, a production line of survival. Meanwhile, Germany's shipyards struggled under bombing raids and shortages. The math of war had flipped. The Allies were no longer counting losses, they were counting replacements. The sea had become a ledger, and the balance was overwhelmingly one-sided. Yet, behind all the numbers, radar screens, and factories, there was still something deeply human. The men who sailed those destroyers and flew those patrol planes weren't just following a system, they were the system. Young pilots scanning empty horizons for hours, sonar operators fighting sleep as they tracked faint echoes through static. Cryptographers hunched over cipher sheets, all of them part of a vast, unseen rhythm that moved like a heartbeat through the Allied war effort. Together, they proved something extraordinary, that when courage and coordination meet technology, even the most invisible enemy can be defeated. And by 1944, the Atlantic, once the graveyard of hope, had become a symbol of methodical victory. The system had not only won the sea, it had changed the nature of war itself. When the war finally ended in the spring of 1945, the Atlantic fell eerily silent. The convoys no longer sailed under threat. The skies above were clear of patrolling aircraft, and beneath the waves the hunters lay still. The once feared gray wolves of Hitler's navy returned not as predators, but as prisoners. Out of more than 1,000 submarines that Germany had sent to sea, nearly 800 never came home. Their rusting hulls still rest there today, scattered across the seabed like iron tombstones. Each one tells the same story, of arrogance met by innovation, of courage swallowed by the deep. The ocean had taken its tribute, and it never gave it back. But this was more than just a naval victory. The Battle of the Atlantic had rewritten the playbook of modern warfare. It was no longer a contest of sheer bravery or bold maneuver. It was a contest of systems. The fusion of science, intelligence, and production had proven stronger than any fleet or doctrine. The Allies had built a network that could think, react, and adapt faster than human instinct alone. Radar pierced the dark. Enigma decrypts turned secrets into strategies. Aircraft extended vision beyond the horizon. What once relied on intuition had become a symphony of precision, a model every military power would study for generations. The Cold War that followed, with its sonar nets, patrol aircraft, and nuclear submarines, would all trace their roots back to the lessons learned here. Yet for all its technological brilliance, the story of the Atlantic remained painfully human. Of the 40,000 German submariners who went to sea, 30,000 never returned, boys in their 20s who vanished beneath the waves in steel coffins. For them, the ocean was not a battlefield of glory, but a graveyard of inevitability. Even Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of their campaign, would later admit, "We were not defeated by better sailors, but by better systems." His words carried the weight of truth, a recognition that courage alone cannot stand against organization, nor instinct against science. The hunter had not been outfought, he had been outthought. Today, the wrecks of that invisible war lie silent, dissolving slowly into the darkness. But if you listen, if you truly listen, you can almost hear the echo of propellers turning somewhere in the depths, the ghostly reminder of the men who once ruled the sea. Their story isn't one of defeat or triumph, but of transformation. Because in the end, the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just about who controlled the ocean. It was about who could adapt to the future. The hunters were hunted, the wolves were caged, and the world learned that power no longer belonged to those who fought hardest, but to those who could see the unseen.